Hello and welcome to our September 6th Lunch and Learn Colloquia. The event is hosted by the Shawn Baum Family Center and the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. Our mission as partners is to improve children's well-being through research, practice, and policy. The Crane Center supports high-quality research with the families enrolled at the A. Sophie Rogers School for Early Learning at the Shawn Baum Family Center in Wineland Park. If you're interested in conducting research with children and families, please take one of the flyers with you today. Our next Lunch and Learn is October 4th in this room at the same time, noon to 1. We'll learn about memory traces for a lost childhood language and adoptees. Our presenter will be Ludmila Isurin, Associate Professor, Second Language Acquisition. Please complete your survey before you leave. It's important to us to be able to offer workshops that you find of value. Our presenter today is Dr. Kelly Purtell, Assistant Professor of Human Sciences. She studies how contextual factors shape health and development among low-income children and how policies and programs can enhance the development of these youth. Please welcome Dr. Kelly Purtell.
Okay, I think I got the right microphone on and the right microphone off. So thank you, Anne, for introducing me, and thank you all for coming. I work with a lot of you, or am colleagues with a lot of you, but this is some work that I've worked on with my colleague, Dr. Ari Ansari, who's at University of Virginia, and I am excited to share it with you because I think I haven't talked to a lot of people about this research. And I'm excited to give feedback on it, but also to think about what are the implications for what we're doing as either researchers or people involved in the policy or the provision of preschool, as well as thinking about kind of future directions of where the field and where practice should go. So the title of my talk is Absenteeism in Head Start, Predictors and Consequences of Missing Preschool. And I'm going to give a very brief overview of just kind of some general information about preschool. It's coming from a policy perspective because I think it just gives a little bit of information about what some of the ways that me and my colleagues got engaged in this research. But I think a lot of you will really be familiar with the things I'm talking about. So I'll go through that pretty quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we know about preschool absenteeism. The short answer is very little from a research standpoint. And then I'm going to start by talking about the consequences. I'm going to try to convince you that we should care about absenteeism and talk about implications of absenteeism in Head Start for children's learning. And then I'm going to talk about a follow-up study that we did with the same data where we really tried to understand why are kids absent. Thinking about if we can understand that, maybe we can prevent it in the future. And then I'll talk a little bit about future directions, some things that people are doing to try to reduce absenteeism, and hopefully we'll have a dialogue. I'm really curious to hear what other people think about absenteeism. So this is really just a slide to make sure we're kind of on the same page. I will talk about preschool. The data I'm using are just Head Start preschools. But what I'm really thinking about is an experience kids are having that is center-based, so it's not going to be in someone's home. It has some sort of instructional component, and it's more than one child, so they're going to be having peer interactions. In the US, we typically think of this as happening at ages 3 and 4, and it's become of increasing importance in recent decades, and I would argue that this is for two reasons. Before I tell the reasons, these are just some figures about how many kids are in preschool the year before they go to kindergarten. And so the orange-reddish color is this center-based preschool care that I'm talking about. These two pie charts represent low-income families and non-low-income families. In part because I'm talking about Head Start, I want to emphasize that the rates look different based on family income. And so non-low-income kids are much more likely to be in a center-based program, about 2 out of every 3, whereas it's more about 50% for low-income families. And you can also see that a big part of this discrepancy is due to the use of parent care only. So these kids are not getting any type of non-parental care the year before kindergarten, and that is over a quarter of the kids in low-income families. I think that a main reason that we see growth in the amount of kids in preschool, as well as growth in it as being a policy issue, is really stemming from two reasons, and I think these reasons play into this preschool absenteeism question. So one reason is that we are trying to provide support for working families. So in recent generations, we have seen more single parents, but we've also seen more households where both parents are working. And clearly when their parents are working, someone needs to be taking care of their kids. And so there's been initiatives to increase preschool more from a child care perspective, but then there's also been a lot of focus on increasing preschool access because of the research that's come out that show long-term positive benefits of preschool. And so really thinking about providing an early educational opportunity for kids. And so we have these older projects that were very tailored and very intensive that showed really positive lifelong impacts. And we have a lot of other studies coming out now that show that preschool increases kids' school readiness. And when you think about what makes it to the general public or what makes it to policymakers' desks, there's really been a few prominent researchers that have kind of opened up the dialogue on this. And so this is a figure that you'll see a lot that James Heckman did. It's from 2006, but you see it in a lot of his work. And basically this figure argues that for every dollar we spend when kids are young, before school age essentially, we're going to get more return on that dollar later in life. And so that if we really want to think about how best to make investments in our society and in individuals, we should really be thinking about making these investments early in life, whether it's through preschool or other types of programming. Just as an aside, we do the opposite. We spend more during the school years than we do during the early years. And so the reality is that we're kind of spending the reverse, at least in terms of those first two parts of the graph. And then this figure is the other thing that I think has really been pretty widespread at this point, even though it's less than 10 years old. And you see it in a lot of newspapers. You see it in a lot of general press. And this is from Shawn at Stanford. And this y-axis is standard deviation. So it's really just about gaps. And so it's about how much better are the richest kids in America doing than the poorest kids. And this is on reading. He's done it for other subjects. And the thing here is that this is across ages. And what you can see is that pretty much this gap is there when they start kindergarten. And it fluctuates a little bit, but it doesn't really change very much throughout the school years. And so it's really pointing to this idea that if we want to reduce this gap, and if that's a goal of us as society, we need to think about what's happening before kids enter school. And because of that, and lots of other research and other initiatives, there's a lot of discussion about trying to expand preschool in our country, particularly for 4-year-olds, although we're seeing more and more movement towards making programs available to 3-year-olds. And most of it's occurring at the local or state level. So some states are trying to move to universal preschool, like Tennessee. Here in Ohio, we have things at local levels. In Columbus, our mayor has put money towards increasing access to preschool. In Cincinnati and Dayton, they actually had ballot initiatives to expand access to preschool in those cities. And in general, there's been some encouragement from the federal government in terms of incentivizing states to do this, but there hasn't been much new investment. The main investment the federal government is making is through Head Start, which they've been doing for a long time now. But we see expenditures growing. They kind of dipped a little bit in the recession, but we now see more and more money being put forth to increasing preschool access. And this is largely because states are expanding what they're doing. That's where that money in is coming. And when they put money in, the discussion is always around access and quality. But in reality, a lot of the money goes to access. It's giving centers money so that they can take in more students without having parents pay tuition or pay very little in tuition. And so we're starting to get really good data on what preschool access looks like, but what we don't have a lot of information on is attendance once they enroll. Anecdotally, people talk a lot about preschool kids being absent quite frequently, more frequently than elementary school kids, but we don't have a lot of empirical data on it. And me and my colleague have been talking about this for a while, and so when we saw data come out that will allow us to answer some of these questions, we kind of jumped at the opportunity. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. As I said, we don't know very much about absenteeism in preschool, and it's largely because we don't have the data. So when you think about elementary school or middle school or high school, schools are required to collect it, right? They have to turn all of that into the federal government, and it's used for a lot of different things, so we know a lot about it. It's not so much of a requirement at the preschool level. In terms of Head Start, there's some requirements that they have about attendance, but mostly it's about an average at the center level. So you're supposed to have an average of 85% attendance, but there's much less requirements about an individual family. There's some talk about it, but when you actually go through the guidelines, it's a lot fuzzier, and they're not reporting it at the individual level. So there's just not a lot of data on it. There's been 2 studies that just came out. These are reports about pre-K expansion in Chicago and Baltimore. And the really nice thing about these studies is that they have administrative data on absenteeism, and they estimate that preschool children in Chicago and Baltimore are missing between 10 to 13% on average. There's a wide distribution on this. There are definitely a fair amount of kids in their study that are missing quite a bit more. But those are really the best estimates that we have from preschool right now. What does absenteeism matter? We know very little about this from preschool. Those same reports in Chicago and Baltimore suggest that it does matter and that the kids who are absent more are learning less. But that's really all we know right now. And I think it's important because if absenteeism does matter, it has a lot of implications for how we design preschool, but also how we think about interpreting the effects of preschool on kids. And so like I said, I'm going to start with the consequences. And so the main research question here is, does absenteeism influence children's learning in preschool? I acknowledge up front that this kind of seems like an of course it does question, but we don't know that for sure. And I think that there's kind of 2 reasons that people talk about why it may or may not matter. So first, we do know it matters in elementary school. There's been lots and lots of studies. These are just some of the more recent ones that show that kids that miss more school learn less in elementary school. So I think it makes sense that we would see a similar thing in preschool. One argument that you do hear, though, is that there's less academic focus in preschool, and therefore maybe missing it doesn't matter as much. This is an argument you don't hear very much from people who work in preschools. I think that everyone is really well aware that there's lots of learning opportunities being given in preschool classrooms today, but it's more like maybe from parents you hear this. Parents may or may not think of preschool as an academic environment for their kids. That may or may not be related to their goals for preschool for their kids. And then on the other hand, we may think that it might matter quite a bit more because when kids are this young, they're very sensitive to routines and structure, and having a day away from that routine might throw them more and interrupt their learning process more. And so what we wanted to do was answer that first question, which is, does absenteeism matter for kids learning in preschool? And we look at it across a year of preschool. We then asked 2 follow-up questions. One, does this association vary based on children's own skills? So if a child comes into the classroom and is behind on what they know, are they going to be more or less affected by being absent? So here we were really thinking, if a child is already struggling, they may be more in need of classroom time, and so they may be more affected by their own absenteeism. And then the third question is, does the association vary by the quality of classroom that should say children are in, not children are. So if a child is in a really high quality learning environment, presumably missing time from that environment might matter more. That was really our hypothesis there. And so these were the 3 questions that we sought out to answer. And so the data we used was the Family and Child Experiences Study from 2009. As of now, this is the most recently available data set that's called FACES. So FACES is a cohort study. Every few years they start a new cohort. And what it is it's a nationally representative study of Head Start programs. And so it's from Head Start centers across the country. And each time they do a cohort, they sample children and they follow those kids across the preschool year as well as follow-up years. So if you're a 4-year-old in FACES, they will follow you through at least the end of 1st grade, depending on which cohort. In this cohort, there was over 3,000 kids in almost 500 classrooms, and it's an incredibly diverse sample, in part reflecting the diversity that we see in Head Start programs, with just over a third Latino, a third Black, 22% white, and then 8% were Asian or other. And for this study, we're really focusing on that first preschool year. So the children could be 3, 4, or 5, and we're following them from the fall of that year to the spring of that year, and that was in 2009 and 2010. We do not have that great administrative data that we would love to have on absenteeism. What we have is parent report. So parents are asked how many days their child has missed since the beginning of this school year. We then do a couple of different things to create the proportion missing. So we have to take into account when the parents were asked this, how close to the end of the school year they were, and kind of project based on that. And then we just also have to account for whether they were in a 4-day-a-week or a 5-day-a-week program. And we do these things and we come up with a proportion of time missed. I will say we also look just at the raw days missed, and we come up with something very similar. And so that's our main predictor in this, is this continuous measure of the proportion of days that they're missing from school. We also look at chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is this idea that the effects of absenteeism are going to be a lot worse when you miss a lot versus missing a little. So this idea of a nonlinear effect, right? Everyone might miss a few days, that may not matter, but what matters is when you're missing a really significant amount of time. And so we define that as missing more than 10% of the school year. In all honesty, we chose this cutoff. You can see a little bit in the histogram that this is a natural cutoff, but really it's what the field does, and we wanted to be able to compare our results to what other people have shown. And so that's the other predictor that we'll look at. We have 3 main learning outcomes. Our measure of language is really just a measure of vocabulary, and it's done with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. We have 2 measures of literacy that we use to create a composite for, in large part because when we look at them individually, they show the same pattern of effects, and that's letter word identification and spelling word. And for math, we look at applied problems, and all 3 of those measures are from the Woodcock-Johnson battery. So to look at this, we tried to think a lot about the fact that kids who miss a lot of school are probably different from kids who don't in a lot of ways. And it may not be missing school per se that matters. It might be they're sick a lot more and their health is what's influencing things. It might be their families experiencing lots of other things. And so we ran our models a couple different ways. We did regression, where we tried to control for a lot of these different factors. And we also did propensity score matching, which is just another way of controlling for these factors. I'm not going to go into the details on any of these, but just to say we ran the models a bunch of different ways and our results looked the same across them. So I'm just going to present the regression results. But to give you a sense of some of the things that we tried to control for, we controlled for different things about the child and family in terms of demographics, like race, parent age, child age, and income. We also wanted to control for things about the school, right? So we wanted to make sure it wasn't just that kids that are in half-day programs show up less, and it's really about being in a half-day that's causing them to learn less. So we controlled for that. We controlled for parenting behaviors. Maybe parents who put their kids in school more also do more learning things at home. We wanted to make sure that wasn't the story we were telling. And then importantly, we did the lag-dependent variable approach, which basically just means that we control for where kids were at when they started school. So we have all of our outcomes measured in the fall and spring, and we control for where they're at in the fall. So what we're really looking at is the gains that they made across that year of preschool. Before I jump into the results, this is what we showed in terms of the proportion of days a child was absent. So we show that kids were missing on average about 5% of the school year. We had a fairly big standard error. We see, I didn't put the histogram in, but we see a lot of variation in this. We see the majority of kids only miss a few days, but then there are subsets of kids. There's one around the 8 or 9 day mark, or 8 or 9% mark, I should say, and then there's kids that are missing more than that. This is a little bit lower than the Baltimore and the Chicago estimates. I think it's in part a little bit different in how we're calculating it, but it's also, it may be attributed to Head Start and some of the features of Head Start that may really be increasing attendance, even though we haven't thought about that before. So to look at our first research question, these are the results when we look at our continuous measure of absenteeism. And so what this is showing, these are standard deviation units. So essentially, for every day a kid is absent, they're learning 0.05 standard deviations less than the kids who weren't. And what we see is that that's significant for literacy and math, but not for language. When we look at chronic absenteeism as our predictor, we see the same pattern of findings. So kids that are missing more than 10% of the school year are learning 0.14 and 0.13 standard deviations less in literacy and math than their peers who aren't missing more than 10%. And so from kind of an academic exercise, we think of these as small effect sizes. They're not ginormous, but when we compare them to other things that we know matter in preschool, which often start with 0.0, these do feel a little bit bigger. So it kind of depends on how you're thinking about them as to whether or not you would think that these are really big effect sizes. To look at the interaction with initial skills, we did interaction terms in our regression models, and then this is just a plot of what we saw for the literacy skills, and essentially what we saw is that we saw support for our hypothesis, which is the kids that were entering school with low literacy skills were more affected by being absent more. So if you came in with high skills and you missed more days, you kind of had this buffer and were less affected in terms of where you ended up. But that was not true for the kids who were entering with low literacy skills. We saw the same pattern of finding for language, but interestingly, we did not see this pattern for math. And then for our last question, we looked at classroom quality. And so to get at classroom quality, we used the class observation, which a lot of you are familiar with, which really is geared towards focusing on teachers' interactions with children. We use the overall class score for this set of models. And what we see is that when kids were in a high quality classroom, the amount they were absent mattered. So if you were in a high quality classroom and you are absent less, you were learning a lot more. So children were gaining about 0.28 standard deviations in high quality classrooms when they weren't absent a lot. They were only gaining 0.12 standard deviations. So about half as much learning was happening. But what you can see with the blue column is that if you were in a low quality classroom, you weren't making a lot of gains whether or not you were there. And so there's a lot of literature that talks about how the class isn't really related to children's outcomes, and that's a finding that we see time and time again. We've seen it in our own work. But what this really suggests is that it might matter a little bit, and sometimes that's getting covered up because kids aren't actually in the classroom to experience it. And so just to summarize that, we really confirm with this what we know from elementary school and probably what we thought going in, that it does matter. But I think there are a couple of implications for what we found with our interaction terms. So one thing to think about is when we talk about the big evaluation of Head Start, the random assignment study, or some of these random assignment studies of preschool expansion in different cities, we might really want to think about including absenteeism into that model. And we have this idea of treatment on the treated, which really just means, did the kids actually go to the preschool that they were assigned to? And we may want to think about going a step further with that and really including absenteeism as part of that. So not only did they enroll in that preschool, but were they actually there a lot? Because the estimates that we get of some of these programs may look quite a bit different. Our skill models were really consistent with this idea of a compensatory model of education, which is education does have the potential to help the kids who aren't doing as well really increase how they're doing. And that came out in our skill models with language and literacy. And then we see that classroom quality does matter, but that those benefits are a lot bigger when the kids are actually in the classroom. I should say that was really only the pattern for literacy. We didn't see patterns for language and math with that. Before I switch gears, does anyone have any questions about these? Yeah. Yes. Yes, less so for this and more so for the next part, which is trying to understand the why. And the why question is also quantitative using this data, but I think it'll become really clear that we're really limited with what we can do quantitatively, at least in terms of where we're at now, in terms of the things we include, and that thinking a little bit about qualitative work that would probably give us a lot more insights and really be an important next step to understanding this. So I'll probably come back to that and what I think we should try to get at qualitatively as I go through this. Sarah. Yeah, it does. It has measures, but they're not great. And so there's a measure of problem behavior that gets at kind of our typical externalizing kids get into trouble type things. And that measure is somewhat sensitive to things, but we didn't see it related to absenteeism at all. The other measure that's kind of the more positive measure about classroom behaviors and staying on task and things like that really has just been shown time and time again to not be sensitive to change, regardless of what you're looking at it in relationship to. And so I never really expect it to be related to things, even though I think from a theoretical perspective, I would actually really think that that would be the behavior that we may actually see attendance and absenteeism really be related to. I think that's a really big limitation of this data, is that we don't really have a good enough measure to get at that. Yeah. I think we just don't have a good enough measure. And it's a measure where it doesn't have good psychometrics. It's just not, I don't know why they don't change it. Right, absolutely. Yes. You can, right. But yeah, the positive and negative are kind of a part of each. And what we tend to see, at least in this, is that we see really similar patterns across the subscales. It doesn't appear to be differentiating. Yeah. Yeah, right. It's related to that like structure and routine and things like that. I am pretty confident in saying there's no data that would let us answer that question. I mean, there may be someone out there who has that data and can look at it, but there's no kind of data that I'm aware of, or even through Crane. But I think so it kind of wraps into some of the stuff I'll talk about next, which is, we always think about preschool as being this thing that's helping families, but in some ways it can sometimes be hard to get your kid there every day and things like that. And so maybe the disruption that it might be leading to could have negative effects, particularly maybe thinking about some of the things that Sarah was just talking about in relationship to, kids really doing better when they have routines. Matt. Yeah, I think we try to account for that in our models the best we can, but it's certainly a plausible alternative, right? Kids are not absent at random, and we know that. And so I didn't really go through all of the covariates we have in large part because it's pretty similar to what I have in the next part, which is where we really try to understand. And it's exactly what you think. These things matter, and they're predictive. And so, we do what we can to control for them, but absolutely, it definitely could be something about the child or the family that's leading to these findings more so than the actual missing of classroom time. There's some work in the elementary school level that's able to use things like, we can't randomly assign kids to absences, but they use like instrumental variables or some other interesting techniques when they're available to try to get more causal estimates. But I think with what's available right now, that's for preschool, that's always kind of a plausible explanation. Yeah. So the next part is really then, why are kids absent? And I think it's important because if we think that reducing absenteeism matters, we need to understand why it happens. But the other reason it's important is exactly for your question, Matt, which is if we're really trying to isolate what absenteeism means, we need to understand the other things that are going on and leading to it. And so there's kind of a couple theoretical perspectives that you can take when thinking about this. And so the kind of overarching one is the bioecological model from Bronfenbrenner. And so there are a couple of things in his model that are really useful to think about. One is the mesosystem, which really focuses on these connections across contexts. And certainly understanding absenteeism in preschool has contributions from both the family and the school environment. And then the other is the idea of bidirectional influences. So you'll see in some of the things that we choose to include in our model that we're concerned that there are things about the child themselves or the child's experiences that may or may not be driving their absenteeism. I have on here health. Obviously, kids are absent for a lot of reasons, but we can't really ignore the fact that sometimes kids are just sick and that's a really big driver. But the accommodations framework I find to be a little bit more helpful because it really is just a specification of the bioecological model. And so the accommodations framework was developed to explain how parents make decisions about childcare and how they decide whether to put their kid in a Head Start center, with their neighbor, to stay home with their child, which center they decide to use, things like that. And the accommodation framework is really focused on the complexity of these decisions. So this is the one thing I'll read because I like this statement, but the underlying principle of the accommodations framework is that children's childcare reflects the ways in which parents accommodate to opportunities and constraints they face as a result of their cultural and social contexts as well as their own capacities and circumstances. And so you can think about parents have different beliefs about the types of experiences they want their kids to have. Parents live in neighborhoods with different childcare opportunities. Parents have different work schedules and different economic opportunities. And all of these factors matter when they're picking their childcare. We can't really look at one unitary thing. And so what we argue in this article is that we could think about absenteeism as an extension of this. It's going to be multifaceted. There are lots of things that may be driving it, but understanding what those things are may be able to help us think about what we want to do in the future. And so we have 3 big buckets of factors that we're concerned about. And so I'll talk a little bit about them from a theoretical perspective, but I've actually just put the variables on these 3 slides. Otherwise, it becomes, you end up duplicating a lot if I go through just the theory now and the measures later. But essentially, one of the big buckets that we talk about and that was part of the original accommodations model is family circumstances and necessity. So this gets into necessity in a couple of ways. So how much do you need childcare? So are there other adults in the house that may be able to help with childcare? What is the employment situation? Things like that. But it also gets into necessity in terms of what you can afford, things like that. And then what other opportunities do you have to get help from others, both in terms of childcare? Do you have other people in your family that can help you provide childcare, but also in terms of social support, with the idea being that a parent who has higher levels of social support may be better able to get their kid there on a regular basis. So maybe you have more people who can help you if you're sick and can't take your kid to school that day, or if you have a conflict and can't take your kid to school that day. And so we tap into 2 different types of social support as well. We also think a lot about family stress and routines. So a family that's under a lot of stress may also be experiencing less regular routines. And so we think about these things and how they may matter for whether or not a child is absent. So we have things that tap into financial stress. So as I said, with this data, we're in Head Start classrooms, and so not all of the families, but the majority of the families are low income, defined by Head Start's criteria, but within that, there's still a lot of variation as to what their financial situation is. And so we look at 3 indicators of financial stress, which is food insecurity, inadequacy of medical care, which really taps into whether or not their child was able to get doctors and dentist visits and they had health insurance, and then receipt of government benefits. So these are benefits other than Head Start. It's typically things like welfare, and they're really commonly used now to indicate that a family is in really needy financial circumstances. We think about stress related to health. So obviously I talked about child health as a clear driver of absences. We have a measure in there that captures some of that, probably not all of that. But you can also think that if the mom in a family is sick, or if the mom in the family is having mental health concerns, that may have big implications for absenteeism. We also look at exposure to neighborhood violence as a marker of stress, and if you're living in a neighborhood that you feel is violent, that reduces the ways in which you can get your child to school. You may have a lot less confidence having someone else take your child to school. It may make it harder to walk your kid to school, things like that. And then we really get into the actual routines measures. And so we have 3 items. One is about the average number of hours a child has slept. One is whether or not a child has a regular sleep schedule. And one is about the number of days a family ate dinner together. And so what we're really thinking here is that if your family has more routines, then the routine of getting your kid to school might be a little bit easier. And then lastly, and in some ways I think most interestingly, because I think these are the things that we have a little bit more control over, is what are these Head Start centers and classrooms doing? And does what a center or a classroom does that matter? So at the center level, Head Starts are all supposed to do some level of home visiting, and parent-teacher communication is a really big emphasis in Head Start. And so but having said that, there's lots of variation how much it happens. So we study how many home visits are happening at the center level and how often there are parent-teacher meetings. We have a list of a variety of services that some Head Starts may or may not provide to families, including medical services, so helping them access doctors and things like that, transportation, and education and job training for parents. And then we have these classroom factors. So these are things that are happening in the classroom. So we do look at the class as a predictor of absenteeism, and so what we're thinking here is that if a classroom is high quality, parents may be more incentivized to bring their kid there. They may recognize that it's better for their kid. Their child might also enjoy going more. And then we have teacher reports of classroom behavior at the class level. So does the teacher perceive their classroom as being well behaved or not? And teachers also report on classroom absences at a classroom level, which I think is interesting when we get to the results. And then we have 2 parent perception measures. So do parents feel like they're welcome when they go to the center? And do parents feel like their kids are enjoying school when they're at the center? And so thinking about this idea of qualitative work, I think understanding what parents are really thinking is really important. And these 2 items don't do much, but they do start to get us towards those things. It's the same data. I really just put this up again in case people walked in late. But it's the same data that I was just talking about, except now our predictors become our outcomes. And so we're looking at absenteeism as a continuous variable and absenteeism as a dichotomous variable with that chronic absenteeism cutoff. We are doing regression models, so OLS when we're looking at our continuous measure, or logistic when we're looking at our dichotomous measure. And we also have included classroom fixed effects models. And what this means is that in this data we have multiple kids in a classroom. So we have like about 5 kids in a classroom. And so what we do in our classroom fixed model is we only compare a child to the other kids in their classroom. And so we can't look at any of those classroom features because they're all experiencing them the same way. But what we can look at is the family features and say, it gives us more confidence that we're actually picking up a family feature and not something about the classroom. And so we run those models too. And we include some covariates in these. So these are things that we weren't really thinking about as the drivers that we were really interested in absenteeism, but things that may still matter. And they're primarily about demographic characteristics. This is our measure. We've gone through that now. These tables are really ugly, but I feel like I like to be really transparent. These models have a lot of predictors. I didn't think it was right to just put up the significant ones. So I want to give you a sense of how much was actually predictive things, but I will also talk through them, so don't strain your eyes looking at them too much. But these are family necessity factors. And what you should, I think the immediate takeaway is not much was predicting on this slide. So our bolded, italicized findings are the significant ones. And there were really 3 drivers on this slide. The first is the number of children in the household. So interestingly, parents, when a family had more kids in the household, kids were less likely to be absent. I keep saying I'm going to go back and check if we can break out the ages of these kids. I don't know if we can, but my assumption is that this is related to older kids being in the classroom and needing the family and the need to be on a school routine for that, contributing to why the kids that are at the Head Start age would also be missing school less. I don't know if that would be true if there are kids younger in the family. The biggest driver on this slide is mom's employment status. So when moms are working full time, their kids are less likely to be absent. And I think that what I wish we were able to do with this data is really look into if it's about their work schedule. If we think full-time jobs often have more regular work schedules, they're often more likely to be 9 to 5, which is more compatible with attending Head Start, whereas part-time jobs are more likely to be varied schedules and second shift jobs. I think that that may be part of what's going on here. But it's also just a necessity, right? If you are working full-time, you need to put your kid in childcare so that you can go to work. The most interesting finding, I think, on this is we ask about all these sources of social support down at the bottom. And so we ask about if all these people in their lives that they perceive as being helpful to them. And pretty much no one really matters except for the other Head Start parents being helpful. So if a parent feels that the other Head Start parents are helpful, their kid is less likely to be absent. And I think there's a lot of different reasons this could be, and it plays into an experiment that some other researchers are doing that I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think one thing may be that they could be providing other ways to get your kid to school, things like that, and that it may be a really tangible way that this is working. When we move to stress and routines, we see a lot more things predicting. We see most of our measures of financial instability are predicting, so that families that are experiencing more problems, their kid is more likely to be absent. But we also see the other main things on here are these routines things. So obviously child health is a really strong predictor, but so is child sleep schedules. So how many hours they're getting as well as whether or not they're having a regular sleep schedule are really related to this chronic absenteeism. And we see that mom's perception of neighborhood violence is also predicting. So moms who perceive more violence, their kids are less likely to be absent. Some of these scales are reverse coded. But we didn't really find anything that was going in the direction opposite of how we would expect. Interestingly, if you just look at the odds ratios and we think about chronic absenteeism, receipt of government benefits was actually our most strong predictor on this slide, more so than child health. In other areas of my research, I really focus on family receipt of benefits and trying to understand how they matter for families. And I often have people telling me it's always about something else. You can't ever capture what that estimate is, and it's always proven true in what I do. And a lot of people really do use this as just a marker of family challenges. And the more and more I do things with this variable, the more and more I'm convinced with that, because it really does seem to just capture and signify that there's a lot of stuff that is going on in that family that is making things more challenging for them and their children. On a more positive note, we do see that things at the center in the classroom matter. So the amount of services that Head Start is providing was predicting less absenteeism. Higher quality classrooms were predicting less absenteeism. And whether the parents felt like their child was enjoying school was predicting less absenteeism. So there does seem to be a sense of if the parent and the child are enjoying and valuing school, that it may be motivating them to actually get their kid there. Interestingly, the number of kids that are chronically absent in a classroom was predictive of individual kids' absenteeism, which kind of makes me think that we're just missing some things. I'm not sure what we can pick up with that, but it may be that there are other classroom things that are really driving this, or maybe it's this center is serving families that are extra disadvantaged, or maybe this center happens to be in a really rural area where transportation is really hard, or like I don't think that there's a good way that we can think about it, but it also could be something more straightforward, which is this program actually cares about absenteeism more and talks to parents more about it, and there's more straightforward things. But I think it's a really interesting finding, but not something we can make a lot out of. Our fixed effects models gave us pretty similar results to our regression models, which we were pretty surprised by. And so it suggests that our family factors are real and they aren't due to other classroom level things. But having said that, there's still the possibility that we're not picking up all of the family factors that we should be. Two other limitations I want to note is our absenteeism measure is far from perfect. It's really kind of the best that's out there at a national level, but obviously administrative data would be a lot more helpful. And these results are only generalizable to Head Start. And so any of you who are familiar with Head Start know that Head Start's a really unique program, and there's just a lot of things going on that are different there. And one big thing I think related to absenteeism is that from the start, Head Start has focused on families beyond just the child. And so given that, it's hard to know if we'd see similar patterns about absenteeism in non-Head Start programs that maybe don't have as much of an emphasis on that. I'm not going to go through these all again because we just talked about them, except to say one of the reasons that we may see the necessity factors matter less here is because we do have this limited range and we're only looking at families that are eligible for Head Start. If we were to include higher income families, those factors might start popping out a little bit more. I think a couple really important remaining questions. Going back to the first study, does when kids are absent matter? So if they miss the first couple weeks when everyone's transitioning, is that more problematic? Is missing a week because your family went on vacation or because you were really sick matter more than if it was spread out throughout the year? We're starting to tap into this in elementary school and higher grades. We haven't really had the data to look at this in preschool yet. And what are the long-term implications? So there's some idea that if parents kind of buy into schooling early and absenteeism is low early, that may continue. We don't have a lot of evidence for that yet though, but does absenteeism in these early years matter long-term? If we think that we want to prevent absenteeism, I think one of the things that's coming up in those studies in Baltimore and Chicago is that parents really just view preschool differently than they view elementary school, and it is a place that they send their kids to but is not nearly as critical to their learning. There's a lot of variation in this attitude, but it's a prevalent attitude, and we don't have a lot of things that capture that, and we don't have a lot of nuance around that. And I think that that's one of the things that we should think about thinking about qualitative work moving forward. But I also think that we should think really broadly about what structural features of preschools could reduce absenteeism. I'm going to skip this slide because it's, again, a little repetitive, but basically the one point I'll make on it is that I think that what this second study shows is that we need to think about what's going on with these families and the complications in their lives if we really want to improve attendance and decrease absenteeism. And I'm not sure that all of the things that we're thinking about from a research community are doing that right now. I think practitioners might be doing a little bit better. There's been a lot of push recently. There are a couple big initiatives to use these text messaging programs where parents are getting text messages to remind them why it's important to not have their kid be absent, essentially. And they came because there were some text message programs about doing literacy activities with your kids that actually did show a lot of change in parent behavior. This is just based on the initial conference presentation evidence, but so far these text messaging programs that are geared towards absenteeism do not seem to be working all that well. And so I think, to me, that's probably because when you look at these complicated reasons that kids are absent or not, a text message isn't necessarily going to solve that. Two more interesting things, I think. Transportation, so there's recent work that came out using kindergartners, using the early childhood longitudinal studies that just found kids who take the bus are absent less. And you could think there might be a lot of different reasons why, but I think making sure that transportation is available is really, it's not universal in school districts certainly, and it's even less so in preschool. There are cities, though, that try to make it so that their bus routes include things like Head Start centers and stuff like that. I think we could be creative about trying to make transportation a little bit less of an issue for families. And then this is another one that hasn't been published yet, but has been presented at conferences, is this experiment where they assign kids to classrooms within child care centers based on who lived near each other, and really tried to increase social capital and make it so that then you know the parents and maybe you can carpool and things like that. And the initial evidence on that is looking much more promising than some of these text messaging programs. So I will end there kind of with the question of if other people have other solutions or ideas. I'd be really interested in hearing them, but I'm also interested in questions. So thank you. No, I haven't. Right. Do you want to explain it a little bit? Yeah. So I think it's kind of like the dual purpose of this might give us more neighborhood community in addition to helping kids get to school. I don't know of any data that's come out on it. I will say Ohio, in their ESSA plan that they had to submit, each state gets to pick outcomes they're interested in beyond the standard, and chronic absenteeism is one that they chose. And so I think you're going to see a lot of talk about absenteeism in Ohio in the coming years. And when you talk to ODE, they are trying to really bring that into their early learning programs too at the preschool level, not just the elementary and secondary level. There's also, I don't know if you guys have seen billboards about your kid missing school, but there's now billboards all over about how your kid shouldn't be absent from school. So there's some public messaging campaigns going on around it. So I think that there's two things. I think one, it is kind of a messaging thing, and I don't think saying don't have your kids absent is it, but I think talking to parents about why it's good for their kids, and not necessarily in terms of they're going to score better on tests, but they're developing these skills with their friends, they're setting themselves up on the right track, things like that. I also think when preschool has routines and has structure, parents start to see the benefits of it. And so I think thinking about what we're doing there matters. But I also just think that there are a lot of structural things that we're not like that. So I think the attitudes matter, but I also think that they don't. So if you're working a job where your schedule changes every week, why are you going to send your kid to preschool when that's the time you have with them, right? And so I think that there are a lot of other structural things in our society. The things I think about are mostly labor force related that also may be really shaping whether or not kids are absent. And I think understanding those a little bit better might then help us. There's a lot of talk about making more center-based preschool-like care available at different hours, because it's not right now. And it's really incompatible with a lot of people's lives, particularly people that are working low-income jobs. And so I think understanding those things, because it's hard to make an argument that this matters more than the time that they have with their parents or things like that. And so I think it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. That's the argument. No. I think it's this interaction of the attitude and the job, right? So we still value that parent time with young kids in a different way, I think, than we do parent time with older kids. And so it's this attitude about what matters most for kids when they're young. But I think part of that is driven by when we start kindergarten, and that's, so it's not, like, it's still, it's very circular in nature, and I'm not exactly sure where in that circle is kind of the best place to try to change attitudes. Yeah, so we don't know a ton about that because we don't know a ton about attitudes beyond anecdotes. There's some evidence I think we have in this data that higher educated parents, I think we show that higher education is related to less absenteeism, but that doesn't really tell us anything about attitudes. That's just kind of a jump that we would be making. I think that people hypothesize that is there, but we really, we know a lot anecdotally about parent attitudes about preschool, and we don't know a lot about it from a research perspective. Yeah. No. We wanted to be able to tap into that a little bit more, and we were kind of disappointed to see that there wasn't more Yeah. So I think there are a couple of reasons that is. One, I think, you know, we don't know who's getting the home visits and who's getting and so that's why I think if we had more data on the parent-teacher relationship, that would be helpful, but those measures aren't specific to a family. The other thing is I was reading I wanted to read about the attendance policies for Head Start, and so I was looking at the Head Start federal guidelines, and basically they say when you have a kid that's missing a lot, you should do a home visit, or you should have a parent-teacher conference. And so there's some reverse directionality going on there too, whereby those things are happening more when the kid is absent more. And so having more stuff about the parent-teacher relationship at an individual family level, I think, is not having that as a limitation here. Okay, well, thank you.